But let's switch gears and talk about another major trial that we have been covering here on the Law and Crime Network. It's dark today, but we have a lot to recap. It's the trial of Charles Merritt. This man is facing 4 counts of first-degree murder and faces the possibility of the death penalty in connection with the brutal slaying of an entire family, the Mcstays, Joseph Mcstay, his wife Summer, and their 2 sons, Gianni, who was 4 years old, and Joseph Jr., who was 3 years old. Their bodies were discovered 3.5 years after they disappeared back in 2010. They were discovered in the Mojave Desert by a biker. It's a chilling case, a tragic case. The prosecution is saying that he killed this entire family for financial gain. He was in financial distress. He had a gambling problem. He owed Joseph Mcstay money, and he took them all out. The defense is saying not so fast, that perhaps the state has the wrong man, and they pointed the finger at an alternative suspect named Daniel Kavanaugh, who was also a business associate of Joseph Mcstay. Let's just go back to the beginning as we analyze this case, and let's go back to the defense's opening statement from, this is from back in January. That's how long this trial has been going on. Brad, 3 days before the family goes missing, we learned yesterday that Joseph Mcstay had sent an email to Charles Merritt saying that he had been overpaid by $42,845. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money being overpaid, and the idea that he'd have to give this money up. The prosecution keeps saying that he was, in financial distress and he had a gambling problem.
Right. Well, don't forget, technically you don't need motive. It's just really good to have in a murder case, and they have it here. But when you match it to the facts, the brutality of the murder, the absence of blood and other evidence, just doesn't match up. No one person could have done such a heinous murder and made it such a spotless crime scene.
Well, I'll tell you what, we showed you what the defense's argument is, or as part of their argument. When we come back, we're going to play the prosecution's opening statement to get you ready for when the trial begins back up again next week. We'll be back. Now, Brad, as we're watching this is back in January. How do you engage a jury after such a long time, 43 days of a jury trial? But we're talking months now. How, as a prosecutor or a defense attorney, do you keep a jury engaged?
Well, I think, as we saw in his opening statement, this is a very sympathetic situation. So they're going to pull on the heartstrings a lot. And there's a lot of information. We have the time lapse, we have the defendant, but we also have the Kavanaugh individual, we have the Botson investigation. So there's a lot of information to keep this going, and I think that's going to keep their attention.
Yeah, well, hopefully so. They have a lot to consider when they're ultimately going to that jury deliberation room, including the testimony of Michael Mcstay. This is the victim's brother, and he had some things. Obviously, a very emotional case for the family of Joseph Mcstay. And we're talking about something that they disappeared back in 2010, and we're in a trial right now in 2019. But, Jessica, what I want to ask you now is trying to get some answers to this. Where do you think this family was killed? Do you think they were killed in the house, or do you think they were killed in the desert? Because the evidence can be split either way.
I think they weren't killed in the house because there would have been some type of evidence left behind, some type of DNA. The house was so clean. There was nothing found in the house, and they had so many years to investigate, right? This happened in 2010. So, to me, I think that they were killed in the desert.
Brad, do you agree?
I lean in that direction. There was a big gap of time between when they went missing that somebody could have cleaned up the house, but I don't think they could have made it so clean that there wouldn't be more DNA than I think there was a little bit of blood they found that might have been there. I think they were killed somewhere else.
Yeah, there was a question of whether or not that was blood spatter on the table, and I think there was a question. And then there was a question of whether or not whoever did this cleaned everything up. Well, Brad, let's not forget, Joseph Mcstay, his body was in a different state than the rest of the family members. He was wrapped up in something. Do you think that tells you about the timeline of the killings? And as Jessica said, how could one man kill a whole family out in a desert?
Well, one man could kill a whole family, but I don't think this one man did. I think he was either the orchestrator of it or involved in it. But remember, I think we're going to see a clip later. There was DNA found in the desert for 3 other people that weren't Merritt. And that's a telltale sign that there was more than one person involved. But the problem is, it doesn't show it actually more reasonable doubt that Merritt wasn't involved. I
guess I want to know, where do you think this trial is going to be going as we enter into day 43? Do you think the defense is going to be pointing more at this idea? And I want to get more onto Daniel Kavanaugh. But the idea here, is it advantageous for them to say, we still don't know what happened, we still don't get it?
I think so. I think we can't lose sight of the fact, and people often do, the prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Merritt doesn't have to raise reasonable doubt. What a lot of people often think. There's nothing, unfortunately, that ties Merritt to the victims. It ties them to a fraud crime and has motive, but nothing ties him to the body, yet DNA ties 3 other unknown people. And that's not beyond a reasonable doubt.
But there's at least things that are suspicious, like the idea that it could have been his car outside of the home on the night in question, the idea of the cell phone evidence tying him to the desert. Brad, I guess the question is, if we talk about the burial site, what evidence is there attaching Merritt to that burial site?
Very little. I think there is a tire track that is comparable or similar to his, but I don't know if they actually tested it to be identical, but I think there's also a second set of tire tracks. And again, like we talked about before, DNA of 3 other people. I think there's more not tying him than there is anything suggesting or tying him to it.
Following up on that, though, Brad, they said that Merritt's phone pinged at a cell tower located about almost 2 miles away from that burial site on February 6th. So that's 2 days after the family disappears. And now he had a sister who lived in the area, but it's not clear if he would have been visiting her at that time. Does that change your analysis?
No, because I think he was involved in it. I think the ping supports that. I think the forged checks support that. I think there's a lot of things tying him to, but there's so much that doesn't tie him to, or so much that suggests somebody else had to be involved, that there's not enough for them to tie him there with the absence of the other people. If they could get one other person, then they could tie it together. But without that, I don't think they do.
Well, let me talk about another person, Daniel Kavanaugh. Now, this is the man who the defense is saying should have been looked at a lot more thoroughly. This is another business associate of Joseph Mcstay. That's pretty incredible to think about being the dispatcher on that phone call, and also to be John Bluth discovering this. But the time in this case I'm very interested about. Discovering bodies 3.5 years later remains. How does that affect a case like this?
Well, it makes it more difficult when you talk about whether or not it's going to be a capital murder case. And I think that's what this testimony is really intended to show, because the statute allows for capital if there's more than one victim, so we have that. But it also talks about if there's torture or a destructive device. So I think having the decay, if you lose some of the evidence of what led to the death, you lose that possibility of capital, torture for the capital finding.
As opposed to just finding the bodies immediately. And Jessica, this case, I mean, they disappeared back in 2010. We're in 2019. How does that affect trial? How does that affect witnesses?
Yeah, again, it doesn't make for a strong prosecutorial case because it's been so long. Why did it take so long for the detectives to hone in on this one person? They had this person all along, so why did it take so long, again, to bring charges? So I think it is going to be very difficult, for sure.
Brad, do you think the defense has an argument here, which they've been continuing to argue, that the prosecution had a narrow focus, that they didn't look at the evidence the right way? They immediately zeroed in on Charles Merritt. There's a lot of red flags, things that were ignored. Do you think that's a fair argument?
I do. This going back to the Kavanaugh potential as an alternative theory. First, they argued, well, he had motive, like Merritt did. Then they claimed that he was in Hawaii, but then they raised, well, maybe he planned it and sent somebody to Hawaii. And there's no camera footage, there's no ATM footage of Kavanaugh, so there's a big missing piece. But I think they went to Merritt because they found him first, they had the checks, and he was the closest person business-wise to the Mcstays.
And Brad, I'll ask you the final question. If it really is a close call between the jury, does that make it less likely, if they ultimately convict him, that they would go for the death penalty?
I don't think so. If they convict him, it's a capital murder because you had more than one victim. And if they believe he did it, it's a gruesome murder. 4 people, 2 children, it's capital murder if they find it's him.
When do you think we're going to get the verdict in this case?
A very long time, given how long it's already taken us.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible, and there's been stops and goes and all this kind of stuff. Brad, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate you breaking down this case as well as the Mueller report with me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jess.
So let's take a quick break. When we come back, our focus is going to be Charles Merritt. A lot to dissect in the past 42 days of trial. We'll be right back right after this.